When we last left, our hero Aeneas was storm-tossed and wishing for death. He was on the verge of capsizing, losing comrades left and right, when suddenly, in a moment of divine intervention, the god Neptune swept in to calm the storm. Now, you might think Aeneas could breathe a sigh of relief here, but it turns out his troubles are just beginning because of all the dirty ports he could have washed up on in all the Mediterranean. He had to come to this one. It's time. We got to talk about Carthage. All right, welcome back. If you are just joining us, we are embarking on a tour of Virgil's Aeneid. This is a Young Heretics special series on Virgil's great epic, the great Roman epic, and possibly the great epic of antiquity, ? Your mileage may certainly vary. There's a long-standing, raging debate, centuries-long debate over whether Virgil's just a knockoff of the Greek epic poet Homer, or whether he stands in his own right as one of the titans of literature. That's part of what we're talking about, but mostly we are just enjoying the adventure of this rip-roaring story. I'm recommending people follow along at home with Alan Mandelbaum's translation of the Aeneid. There are lots of English translations out there, many of them good, but this is my favorite. Something I didn't mention that is a major advantage of this edition, at least if you get the version I have, is that it has these awesome illustrations by Barry Moser. They kind of remind me of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series. I don't know if you guys read those as kids, but I used to love those in high school and middle school. There were these incredible short stories, ghost stories, and they were illustrated with these utterly gruesome illustrations. I mean, I can't now believe that we were allowed to look at these things, and they were done in this similar style of like black ink on white, and they had these deep shadows and incredibly demented pictures of all the stuff that was going on. And that's not quite what's going on here with Moser. I actually looked it up because I wanted to see if it was the same artist, but it's not. It's a similar style, and he gets these very dramatic images. So the opening, the first one, of book one, which is what we're talking about, is this ship almost on the verge of falling back into the water, a very stylized but beautiful depiction of the storm that Aeneas has just survived at sea. And there's lots more where that came from. So we are going to talk now about the aftermath of the storm, and I'm going to give you the deep background that you need to know in order to understand not only book one of the Aeneid, but the whole context of this poem and this new era that Rome is embarking on. Last week, I talked about the dawn of the Augustan age and what it meant for Rome to become an empire and why it was important in that moment for Rome to have this grand new epic, sort of similar to what America has just gone through, where this big, almost constitutional crisis that we've had, and now this new era dawning of the 250th anniversary. And, art is a really important part of this kind of civic moment where you're trying to recapture a sense of pride in who you are and where you come from. But it's a finicky business for Virgil, and I talked about that last time. Now I want to talk about the major rival, the kind of shadow Rome or the alternate that Rome had to face down in order to reach this point. Every great civilization, every great hero of an epic needs a kind of foil or an alternate, an antagonist even, and Carthage is it for Rome and for Virgil. I would even say that it's possible Carthage is another character in the poem, as big a character in the poem as Aeneas himself is. So we're going to get into talking about that. I have to pause first, though, to just give a brief update in classics news. I wanted to fill people in because I've been talking about this movie that's coming out, Christopher Nolan's adaptation of the Odyssey, and that's been in the background of this discussion because we're doing epic literature on this show. We've been reading Homer, we've been reading Virgil, and Homer's Odyssey is getting a Chris Nolan adaptation, and I've been kind of following along, and I was expressing some cautious optimism, some qualified hope about this Christopher Nolan version. I like him as a director. I've liked his movies, and it's awesome to imagine him doing a big, grand, epic Odyssey. And it would be cool, as we're reading the Aeneid, to get a good Odyssey adaptation, because, as I've said, the first 6 books of this poem basically are a riff on the Odyssey, or a reference to the Odyssey. They're playing with all the different themes of that journey and that story. Now I'm a little bit blackpilling. I'm a little depressed. I have to kind of walk back some of my optimism, because at least in reports, the website Deadline has reported that Tom Holland is going to be playing the lead in the Odyssey. And I was saying before that the cast that's been announced, they haven't really said who's going to play what role, but I was hoping that Matt Damon was going to be the guy that played Odysseus, and that it would be about his journey. Now I feel like if Holland is playing Odysseus, this is like, I'm a little bit less excited about this project, but I'm always ever the optimist. I'm still holding out hope. A buddy of mine, Emmett Penny, pointed out to me that this might not mean that Tom Holland is playing Odysseus. It might mean that Tom Holland is playing Telemachus, Odysseus' son, but that he is the center of the story, that Nolan wants to make it about this coming-of-age narrative. Can Telemachus find his way as a young man without a father? That was a major theme of our series on the Odyssey, if you remember when we talked about it. So possibly that will still be good. I still wish they would just make like a good old-fashioned, straight-on adaptation of this poem that tells the story in some of the ways that Homer told it. But I'm always holding out hope. I'm not going to pass judgment on this at the outset, but I wanted to update you guys on that. And I'll drop a link in the show notes, because we've been kind of following how this has been going. And currently, like, I would say that my mood is like 10 degrees darker now about this whole thing, but we will see. And the good thing is that no matter what Nolan does, no matter how well or badly any modern person interprets and adapts the ancient stuff, we still have the good stuff, and that is the point of this show, is getting to the good stuff. We don't need to wait for Christopher Nolan to make an adaptation. We can read the originals on our own with a little bit of help and insight and practice and study. This is something that you have ownership of. This is your heritage as a citizen of the West and of the Western canon and Western tradition. This stuff belongs to you, and that's what this show exists to do, is to give you access to it. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. You can subscribe anywhere you're listening or watching, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts. Hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be doing an episode every week, taking you through the Aeneid bit by bit, giving you the background that you need to get the most out of this poem and really enjoy it at the max. And hit subscribe, rate 5 stars, share, all that good stuff as we embark now on the story of Carthage. So I said that Carthage is almost like a character in this poem. In fact, a main character, I would say, in this poem, in the same way that Rome is a main character. It hasn't come into existence yet, it hasn't been founded yet, but it is on the verge. Aeneas' whole story, his whole labor, is to get out of Troy, bring the legacy of the Trojans, the Dardanians, forth from Troy and carry all that was great about the past into the future and to found Rome. And Virgil, in telling this story, is talking about what Rome is in the grand scope of history. And in order to do that, he has to take account of Carthage. I said that, Carthage is... I said that there are 2 registers in this poem last time, that Virgil begins daringly, innovatively for an epic poet. He begins by saying, I am singing. He says, I, the human poet, that is the writer in this case of this poem, I have a story to tell you about this man, Aeneas. But then he goes back into the higher epic register with the more traditional way of starting a poem, and that is to invoke the muse, to say goddess muse. The muses were the goddesses of poetry and art and singing, and he asks the muse to tell him a new part of the story. If he's the one that's going to tell us about Aeneas, then he says, Muse, tell me about quo numine lyso, with what kind of wounded godhead was Aeneas chased. And so there are 2 levels in this poem. There's the human level, where the human poet is talking about this individual Aeneas, who, as we discussed, is not particularly impressive when we meet him. He's a little bit he's a little bit not up to the task, at least at first. He's wishing he were dead. But then there is the divine level of fate, great and cosmic history and what's destined to happen. And it's at that level that Aeneas can't avoid his fate and his responsibility. And I said last time that Zeus reassures Venus, Aeneas' mother, the goddess of love, that this is all going to play out exactly as planned. There's an Iliadic component to it. If you remember from the Iliad, the line that the plan of Zeus was being worked out to its full, Virgil is concerned with that too, with the grand sweep of history level of things. And this is kind of a great man of history back and forth. We have the human register of the individual Aeneas. How's he going to live up to his challenge? But then we have the capital H history register where the gods are operating and bringing these plans to their fulfillment. And it's at that register, that sing, O muse, divine, capital H history level, that Carthage comes into the story. It's almost the first thing we start to hear about when we hear about Juno, the wife of Zeus, that is Hera in the Greek, when we hear about Juno's anger and why she's trying to stop Aeneas from getting where he's going, we hear immediately about Carthage. It takes Virgil 90 plus lines to introduce the name Aeneas. He makes us wait for a long time to meet the main character of the human story, but it takes him only 13 lines to name Carthage, or in Latin, Carthago. If you've ever heard that phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. That's part of this Roman rivalry that they had, and this kind of back and forth battle between these two great empires. We're going to get into that and explaining why it was that Carthage, in the view of Cato, had to be destroyed. But first, I want to read to you the passage where Carthage is introduced. And like I say, very, very early on, as soon as we switch to this divine register, start talking and asking the muse to inspire, we hear about Juno and we hear about her love for Carthage, for Carthago. And as always, when I introduce a passage from the poem here, I'm going to be reading you my own translations. There are other translations that you can get, of course, with Mandelbaum or whoever, but I want you to have my own version so that I can dig into the Latin with you a little bit as well. And we begin here with an important introduction, in the same way that we had arma virum quae cano, those three important words at the beginning of the poem. We have three more important words. Urbs antiqua fuit. There was an ancient city. Every word of that is important. The city part is important because that tells you that this is already an established power when Rome is still a bedraggled series of refugees. When Rome is just a glint in the eye of Zeus, there is already an urbs antiqua, an ancient city that has been there for a long time, and fuit might be the most important word in that sequence, because fuit is in the past tense, and Virgil is very, very conscious of the tense of his verbs. We had a moment recently where Aeneas, last time when we talked, this is going to come later in the poem, but last time when we talked about Aeneas having a moment of despair, and in that moment Virgil switches to the present tense because he wants us to be immersed in the moment of the story. He's calling out, he's full of anguish, all of that is going on in this immediate emotional way, but in this section he wants us to emphasize that there was, once upon a time, a place called Carthage, because there ain't now. That's the context of this entire story, and it's something you have to understand. It's sort of like at the beginning of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, the narrator says, Jacob Marley was dead as a doornail. This must be understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the tale that I am about to relate. In much the same way, we have to understand that Carthage is dead as a doornail, and that fuit is there to remind us of that. This is, on the one hand, this is an enormous and an ancient power that must be reckoned with. On the other hand, this is a power that is dunzo. It is from the past, and that's something that we are thinking about too. So just as Rome is kind of starting, or the embryonic phases of Rome are beginning, Carthage is already an established urbs antiqua, ancient city. And so here's what we're told, and this is why Hera hates Aeneas and wants to prevent the founding of Rome, or at least to meddle with it as much as possible. There was an ancient city held by Tyrian colonists, opposite from Italy, far away from where the Tiber meets the sea, rich in industry and treasure, ruthless in war. It's said that Juno loved it more than all the rest, cherished it more than Samos, stored her weapons there, her chariots, her cavalry. The goddess hoped, if fate allowed, to make it ruler of the world, and so she tended it and doted on it. Okay, Carthage, unlike Aeneas, is well established, and it is beloved and protected by one of the most powerful gods in the world, by Hera, by the wife of the king, the queen of the gods. She has her weaponry there, she's invested in it, and importantly, this idea of the female warrior goddess as the protector of Carthage is going to come in down the road as we meet the queen of Carthage, who is Dido, the mythic, in the same way that Aeneas is the mythic ancestral figure of the Roman Empire, Dido is the mythic ancestral queen of Carthage. And so Virgil here is engineering a meeting between these two civilizations in their infancy, or at least in their mythic past, and also between these two individuals. But fate is going to intervene, because if fate allowed is doing a lot of work there. Si qua fata sinant, if the fates should permit it. He's saying what Juno wants more than anything is to bring Carthage to rule the world. And if you had looked at the Mediterranean in, 300 or 400 BC, and you had said, here are all of these various powers that are in this Mediterranean Ocean. If you look at the map and you say, here's Italy, here's Greece, here's North Africa, which one of these powers do you think is going to rule the world one day? If you would ask somebody that, then nobody would have said Rome. Nobody would have predicted that the name on everybody's lips, the thing that men think about once a day, the world historic empire, is this little Italian city that is kind of mucking around in this farming culture. You would have been much, much more likely to say, oh, Carthage. Carthage is the Phoenician empire. That is, it's part of this ancient people, and they are clearly on their way to gaining maritime control. They're seafarers, which is really important because it's the Mediterranean. So if you want to exert control over this area, surely you have to be good at sailing and having ships and doing commerce. By that means, Rome has no navy. Rome is purely a land power. So, of course, you would have predicted that Carthage was going to rise up. And that's the brilliance of this counterfactual, this alternate history that Virgil just suggests here, is that Juno wanted that. The queen of the gods was looking at this power and thinking, these are my guys, and I'm going to raise them to prominence, if the fates should allow. But it turns out, of course, that fates have other things in mind. And this is importantly reminiscent of that moment, if you remember from the Iliad, when Zeus really wanted to save his son Sarpedon. But Hera said, the gods are never going to agree to that. It's fate for him to die at this moment. He is immortal. He must die. Now the tables are turned. And even though it would seem totally plausible that Carthage would rule the world, the fates have other things in mind. And that's what Virgil wants us to think about, or to imagine in the background of this. We now know, Virgil's audience would have known, how the story ends. And so what I want to tell you now is how the story did ultimately end. And to do that, I have to tell you the story of the Punic Wars. I mentioned that the Carthaginians are Phoenician peoples. That is, they're from this larger set of people groups called the Phoenicians. And the Punic Wars, which are famous wars in the history of Rome, are named Punic because Punic just means Phoenician. So this was this clash of civilizations much, much later than the time when the Aeneid is set. But in the background of the whole story, as part of what is destined to happen, is this many, many years-long conflict between Rome and Carthage. It's just this cosmic Avengers Endgame sweep of history stuff. This is like the wheels of fate churning in a way that no man, no individual, Aeneas especially, could never have predicted that this was going to happen. But Virgil knows, and we're supposed to know that it's going to happen. So I'm going to tell you about it so that we can be aware of this as we move forward through this first book of the Aeneid. But first, how's your New Year's resolution coming along? How's it been? Did you make a promise to yourself at the beginning of this year that you were going to maybe eat a little healthier, maybe work out a little bit more? I know I did, and I love New Year's resolutions. There's a kind of joke or a meme online that you never satisfy your resolutions, that you always fail in them and you always fall short and you always come to the end of the year and you realize you didn't do the thing. I don't know that that's true at all. I think if you pick your resolutions well and if you exert a little discipline, you can, in fact, improve every year. But we're all humans, and you need to build a little bit of wiggle room and leeway into any kind of plan that you have. Understand that you're not going to be going at 110% all of the time, and this is definitely true when it comes to diet. If you are trying to eat well, which I do, if you are trying to be healthy and be in peak physical condition, you have to leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room or you are bound to fall off the wagon, and that is why I am so glad to be sponsored by Field of Greens this year. Field of Greens is an awesome life hack that makes it way, way easier to keep your diet optimal, even when you're living a normal life or a very busy life like I am. One of the things that can be really, really hard is getting the fruits and vegetables that you are supposed to get. You're supposed to get 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Ain't nobody got time for that. I know I don't. I don't think anybody really has time to constantly be buying fruits and vegetables and preparing them. Or if you do, that's like your whole job. So Field of Greens takes that off your hands with a carefully calibrated, doctor-recommended, doctor-supported, and evidence-supported drink that you can drink that will give you those servings of fruits and vegetables, get you the nutrients your body needs. I love the energy that it gives me, but it's got all kinds of excellent benefits that will just help your body to function maximally. If you take it every day, your doctor is guaranteed to comment on your improved health next time you see him or her. And if you are one of my listeners, if you're a Young Heretics listener, you have a special offer. You will get 20% off your first order when you enter Heretics, Heretics, at checkout at fieldofgreens.com. So that's fieldofgreens.com, and use the promo code Heretics, Heretics, to get 20% off. This is something I heartily recommend. I only take sponsors on this show that I really believe in. I'm very lucky that I don't have to be taking every possible sponsor that comes to me. So I've picked these guys because I believe in them, and I think that you are going to get a lot out of them if you use them as part of your New Year's resolution, part of your health regimen and routine this year. That's fieldofgreens.com. Use the offer code Heretics at checkout for 20% off. Okay. Let's talk about Carthage, the historical Carthage, not just the mythological Carthage that we were introduced to in the opening of this poem. Carthage is the rival to Rome. At least that's how it looks to Virgil, looking back. At the time, it might not have seemed that way. As this rivalry developed in the 200s and 100s BC, it might not have been obvious that Carthage was the foil. But looking back with the hindsight of history, it becomes clear, and it immediately became clear to ancient historians, that these two were, in some sense, made for each other. They were like yin and yang, and they were perfectly matched as opposites. They didn't start as rivals. They did not begin in an adversarial relationship. In fact, they had a kind of friendly, complementary relationship. And they had worked together, for instance, if you've heard of the Pyrrhic Wars, they fought together against this king, Pyrrhus, and the name Pyrrhic victory comes from that conflict, where Rome and Carthage were on the same side against Pyrrhus. And there are good reasons why these two powers could have played along, could have played nice if Rome's history had gone a little bit differently. There was, Carthage had this naval power. They were of Phoenician ancestry, which meant that they could control the seas. They had a maritime commercial empire. Rome was a land empire that was mostly focused at the outset of the Punic Wars, mostly focused on shoring up its power in Italy, beginning to become an expansionist power. And it did have this ethos, this kind of military honor code ethos that made it very hard in retrospect for it not to take over the world. But at the time, it seemed like, well, maybe these are two powers that can kind of coexist. But what happens in that kind of what we would now call a Thucydides trap, when you have two great powers that are growing and taking shape in one region, in this case the Mediterranean, it's very likely that ultimately they're going to have a conflict of interest. And when that happens, it can be extremely explosive, extremely quickly. And so that is effectively what happened. We have three Punic Wars, at the beginning of which Carthage is probably the odds-on favorite. Carthage is the established power. Rome is the upstart power. Carthage has the sea, which the Mediterranean is basically all sea, so they have a big advantage there. By the end of it, Carthage is dust, ruin, rubble, utterly gone, wiped off the map, and we remember it now basically only in reference to Rome. If you're not an ancient historian, you probably don't have an interest in Carthage for its own sake, except as the rival of Rome, which became by far the dominant power in the Mediterranean and beyond. And the destruction of Carthage, the total annihilation that ends these three wars, the destruction of Carthage was so great that it is actually one of the wars described by Victor Davis Hanson in his latest book. If you know Victor Davis Hanson, I think a lot of my listeners are probably familiar with him. He's a writer on ancient history and modern politics, and he has this new book called The End of Everything, and it's about total war. It's about destruction and disaster. The Third Punic War, where Rome razes Carthage to the ground forever and always, salts the earth. That is one of the total wars that Victor Davis Hanson writes about. So that book I would recommend if you're interested in knowing more about this, but I want to read to you just one passage from that book because he sets up this opposition really nicely. Victor Davis Hanson writes, like the earlier rivalry between democratic naval Ionian cosmopolitan Athens and oligarchic infantry-based Doric and tradition-bound Sparta, the competition between Rome and Carthage involved antithetical civilizations. A lot of information just in that one sentence, but what he's basically saying is we've talked on this show about the rivalry between Athens and Sparta a lot, and there was a kind of yin-yang complementary aspect to that rivalry, and it was similarly, I mean, when we talk about the Thucydides trap, we're talking about that conflict between Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. What Victor Davis Hanson is saying is now we have a repeat of that, in some sense, on a much grander scale, a bigger stage for that same kind of conflict. Rome was an infantry power, writes VDH. After 275 BC, the Roman legions had unified most of Italy south of the Po River. Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean by sea. Carthaginian allies and colonies were spread throughout Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and along the coast of Spain. So if you picture a map of the Mediterranean on YouTube, I'll throw one up on the screen so you can look at it. Carthage is based in North Africa. That's their center of power, but they are scattered kind of around the Mediterranean. Rome is taking control of Italy. And so, of course, you can see that in the middle of those two things are these islands in the Mediterranean, especially Sicily, which is right on Rome's backyard. It's right in their backyard, right at their back door. And that's going to actually be the powder keg that sparks off this first conflict is Sicily. But Carthage has got Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and along the coast of Spain. They were all considered an eventual and intolerable barrier to Roman expansionism. So it would have been considered natural that Rome would stop at the Carthaginian Empire. During the contentious course of the 3rd century BC, Rome and Carthage inevitably had collided in two long and brutal wars, now known formally as the First and Second Punic Wars. So that's the setup here. The opening is that you've got these two powers, Carthage, kind of a hard backstop against what is becoming Rome's border. Rome is expanding in Italy. And it seems like this is kind of how things are going to go. That inevitable conflict, now in retrospect, inevitable conflict where they meet together, turns into the defining great power struggle of Rome's history. This is going to kick off the era when Rome really becomes the empire. And of course, it's not going to formally become an empire until the days of Virgil, until the 30s BC with Augustus and the Battle of Actium. But the territorial acquisitions that make it into an empire in all but name are going to be the major barrier to them is Carthage. And so there's a kind of defining showdown that's brewing here where if Rome can't beat Carthage, it can't become what it eventually does become. And so when Polybius, the ancient historian Polybius, sets out to explain how Rome came to be the great power that in his day it was, he talks about the Punic Wars, and especially the Third Punic War. But he sets out to explain this in book 1. He talks about the first one, And he says something quite similar to what Victor Davis Hanson says. In fact, I wonder if VDH has this passage in mind from Book 1 of Polybius, where he says, "I shall endeavor to describe with somewhat more care the first war which arose between the Romans and Carthaginians for the possession of Sicily. For it would not be easy to mention any war that lasted longer than this one, nor one in which the preparations made were on a larger scale, or the efforts made more sustained, or the actual engagements more numerous, or the reverses sustained on either side more signal. Moreover, the two states themselves were at the precise period of their history where their institutions were as yet in their original integrity." He's saying these are two powers that are at their height civilizationally. They are not declining powers. They aren't decadent powers. They have a kind of martial vigor to them on either side. Their fortunes are still at a moderate level and their forces on an equal footing, so that those who wish to gain a fair view of the national characteristics and resources of the two had better base their comparison upon this war rather than upon those which came after. Because later on, of course, Carthage is going to get totally pwned and destroyed, but Polybius is saying at the outset, you have to remember that these were two great powers very, very evenly matched. And Polybius, by the way, is purposefully one-upping Thucydides here. In the same way that Virgil often tries to one-up Homer, there's that tradition of competition among the epic poets. There's also a tradition of competition among the historians. And Thucydides, when he's describing the Peloponnesian War, says basically there was no greater conflict before this. This is kind of the pinnacle of conflict up to this point. It involves these two great powers, Athens and Sparta. Polybius is here saying, not anymore, bub. We're stepping in. We've got an upgrade now, and we're talking about the Punic Wars. And so this is like, part two. This time it's global. The version of the new version of the Peloponnesian War is the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. And in the lead up, this is something that seemed kind of accidental, or history, when it's playing in its forward direction, when you're living through history, it never looks faded. It's only in retrospect that it starts to look faded. And so in the lead up to the First Punic War, it actually turns on something that seems relatively minor over the time, and that is this conflict over Sicily. Now remember, Sicily is in Carthage's sphere of influence. Carthage has territory in the west of Sicily, and in the east, it's dominated not by Romans, but by Greeks. There's a long-standing Greek colonial relationship with Sicily, and there are tyrants, that is, autarkic rulers, solo rulers, who are known for having control there. And that's the state of play in Sicily when, suddenly, in the 260s BC, there is this moment when the Greek leader against the Mamertines, who are their enemies, they reach out to Carthage for help. The Mamertines reach out to Rome. And when this happens, Carthage is totally taken aback, and this kicks off 23 years of utterly brutal conflict. It expands, bursts throughout the entire region, basically like a powder keg, and you have the First Punic War, which begins with Rome at a serious disadvantage, and that is no navy. In much the same way as the Athenians had to build their navy to fight back the Persian invading forces back in the 480s BC, now Rome is at a loss fighting this naval power in the Mediterranean, thinking about how they're going to win. And they have always won. They are proud of their history as a military power. So one of the things they end up doing is basically building a navy from scratch. They take a shipwrecked Phoenician ship and they basically reverse engineer it and reconstruct it. These are top-of-the-line naval technologies that they are now basically reconstructing from scratch, and they end up meeting Carthage at the sea. Sort of. They're not very good at naval battle, the Romans aren't. And so one of the things they do is they come up with this ingenious tactic for turning naval battle into land battle. They invent something called the corvus, which means the crow, because it's shaped a little bit like a crow's beak that latches on to the ship. And so when the two ships meet, when the Romans meet the Phoenicians, they basically board their opponent's ships, and they fight on the deck of the ship as if they were having a land battle. So all of this kind of forced innovation helps Rome to develop as they are doing their level best to defeat Carthage. They meet perhaps their greatest opponent in Hamilcar Barca, their greatest opponent yet in Hamilcar. Barca means lightning, so this is like the Thunderdome guy, the guy that is, leading the Carthaginian forces. Rome, though, ultimately is victorious, and this importantly involves kicking Carthage out of a variety of places, including the territories in Sicily that were initially at issue. And so Carthage is seriously in retreat all of a sudden, for the first time, or at least in a way that it would never have predicted at the outset of this. Suddenly Carthage is fighting kind of a rear guard action. And it is in that context, humiliated and burned by the First Punic War, that the Carthaginian Empire strikes back. And the Punic War number 2 is perhaps the most famous one, because that's where we get Hannibal. Not Hannibal Lecter, although the guy in Silence of the Lambs is named after Hannibal, but Hannibal Barca. So Hannibal famously takes his elephants across the Alps. This is a major moment in military history. The Carthaginians have elephants. The Romans are totally stymied by this, and this is an affront to Roman integrity. Crossing over into Italy, into the Roman homeland, terrifying the Romans and bringing them within an inch of defeat. This is one of the most delicate and frightening moments in Roman military history, and they will remember it ever afterward. So we've got dramatic reversals of fortune here. First, the Carthaginians, who are pushed back by the Romans and suddenly made to taste defeat in this major way. They've now sent their own general back, Hannibal, to threaten the Romans, who are now horrified and affronted by this attack upon their heartland. They just pull out a victory. Hannibal is recalled. There's the famous Battle of Zama, at which Scipio Africanus defeats Hannibal and gets that name, Africanus, for having defeated the African general Hannibal. And now the Romans are absolutely on the warpath, and it's kind of amazing that they don't just raze Carthage to the ground here and now, but they do strip them of all their territory, all their rights to defend themselves. I mean, this is a Versailles-level treaty where they basically just neuter the Carthaginian Empire forever afterward. Shocking reversal, total upset and overthrow, not what you would ever have expected, and now Rome truly is set loose on the region in a way that they were never before. There is this huge new vista opening up in the face of this war, at the end of this war, but Rome is not satisfied. One of my favorite other podcasts that I do recommend, they have great stuff on the Carthaginian War if you're interested, is The Rest is History with Tom Holland. And one of the things that Holland says about Rome is that they're kind of like mafiosi, like they're mob bosses, where if you insult them, if you challenge their honor, they will never ever let that go. They can't let it go. And that's what effectively happens after the Second Punic War. That's when you get the famous Carthago delenda est. This is Cato the Elder in every speech before the Senate ends with Carthage must be destroyed. And if you are a Latin student and you're learning rudimentary Latin, you will have translated this phrase a bunch of times because it has what's called a gerund construction in it. The gerund is delenda, and this is a wonderful form of the verb that implies an imperative. So it's actually an adjective form of the verb. It describes Carthage as the needing to be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. And so this is something that Cato is just insisting upon again and again and again. They finally get their chance. The pretext comes when Carthage has to defend itself against the Numidians. So remember, Carthage is now stripped of its arms, its territories, its defenses. It has basically been neutered. It's been cut down, and therefore they're prevented by the treaty from defending themselves against this existential threat from Numidia. They appeal to Rome for help. Rome refuses or denies help to Carthage, and ultimately they just basically have to take up arms to defend themselves, and Rome uses this as the pretext for settling the score for finally settling accounts here and utterly destroying Carthage. That is the end, and that is why it's in VDH's book, The End of Everything, is because at this point, Carthage will become almost a byword for total annihilation and destruction. Okay, here's what I love about this when it comes to the Aeneid. If you're playing the tape forward, if you're experiencing this history in real time and thinking through each successive stage of these Punic Wars, it all seems like a kind of series of accidents. They say history is just one bloody thing after another. It feels that way when you're living through it. It always feels that way. The technical philosophical word for this is contingent. It feels like anything could happen, and whatever happens could have been different. In the immediate term, you can see how everything kind of followed on like dominoes, one thing after another. Well, first, of course, you have these two powers in the region, and then they get into a fight over this minor territory in the middle, but that leads to this larger conflict, and then once Carthage is humiliated, they have to send this army back, and Hannibal especially is made to swear by his father on the carcass of a sacrificial victim that he will never be a friend to the Romans. And so, of course, he has to go do that, and then once that happens, Rome is naturally going to develop a vendetta. And these things start to spiral out of control until you have the total annihilation and obliteration of this ancient empire, the Urbs Antiqua Fuit. It is no more. It was, and now it ain't. All of that, you can see how it happens, you understand it, but also you could see how things could have gone differently. You can imagine alternative scenarios in the forward direction of history, when you're playing the tape forward. When you're playing the tape backward, when you stand in the present and you look back at everything that happened, it starts to seem like a grand design. It starts to have the structure of a story, as if it's being told by these greater minds than ours. And you can see it as the conflict of capital H history. These two empires were bound to come into contact with one another, into conflict, and now it looks like this epochal moment in Rome's development, because once Rome becomes the victor, everything starts to look like it was part of Rome's story, from Rome's perspective, and you think, well, this was its great trial. The great trial was to come up against this ancient people, the Phoenicians, who were culturally on the level with the Greeks, but militarily far surpassed them, were much more powerful than the Greeks at this point. And also, they had to reenact that Greek conflict between Athens and Sparta, and it was just the most poetic thing that could happen was bound to happen, and that was for this uprising power to test itself and find itself victorious, with the whole world now at its disposal. And so when you look back and you play the tape backwards, you can tell the story as a kind of cosmic journey that could never possibly have gone any other way. And that's always the way it is. And we never know from our human perspective whether one of those things is true or both of them are true or somehow some combination of the two. When we're living in time forward and playing the tape forward, it always seems like anything is possible. When we look backward a lot of the time, it seems like the story is being told by a greater mind than ours. And that's always how it works. That's sort of part of the human condition, is that we can only live history forward, but we can tell it as art backwards. And what's brilliant about the Aeneid and what makes it such a wild innovation and what makes it different from Homer in all these sorts of ways is that Virgil finds a way of telling both stories at once. He's playing the tape forward and he's playing the tape backward at the same time. And he does it with this double register by introducing Aeneas and himself as the poet at this very human level, this very uncertain guy, doesn't know what's coming next, isn't sure, feels like he wishes something else had happened, like there were an alternate history where he had died. He doesn't want to be on this journey. He doesn't feel up to it. But then at the same time, also at the outset, he introduces the Muse and Juno and the conflict of fate and the ancient city of Carthage that was and is no more. And so he's telling it also at that level of cosmic history where it seems that everything is set in stone and it could never have been any other way. And what Virgil is doing is he sets up those two things and he plays the tape in those two directions to engineer the tension of how are these two things going to meet one another. And that's mirrored in the opening line. Arms and a man. Grand battles, grand sweep of history on the one hand, personal, individual journey on the other. And when we start out, Aeneas is in the Odyssey, but he has to get to the Iliad. He has to get to this grand cosmic historic level that the gods are already on. And all of that is in the background, and Virgil's readers would have seen that when Carthage was introduced, and when it turns out that Aeneas, after this first great storm, washes up, where else? Carthage. And I've said before that the Aeneid is a very dense poem. That is, it takes a lot of careful unpacking in a way that Homer doesn't always. Of course, it's always great to know about the background of Homer, and we had lots of cool things to talk about, but there's a kind of flow to Homer that makes him, I think, easier to translate, that makes him more fun to recite in some ways. He was an oral poet, that is, he was speaking and singing, and so you had to be able to hold an audience's attention with these kind of digressions and this much, almost hairier kind of style. Virgil's not that way. Virgil is a writer. Virgil's choosing every word carefully. He's thick and dense, and every word is really full of allusions, and we're supposed to understand him within this web of history and within this web of narrative and context. And so that's why it really helps and pays to look at this history before you start to dive into some of these passages that might otherwise feel like kind of throwaway passages. Once you know the history, you can kind of start to unlock a lot of the stuff that Virgil is doing. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to show you one passage that's a very, very famous passage, one of Virgil's most kind of celebrated moments early on in this poem that now you will be able to understand. But if you were just coming to this poem for the first time, you might brush right over this passage because it's basically just, it just looks like scene setting. It just looks like a description of the way that Carthage looks as Aeneas washes up on shore. But let's take a look at it, and now we'll be able to understand it in a whole new way. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. We're just getting started on the Aeneid, and you can listen on Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Rate us 5 stars, spread the word. That really helps the show. So we're in book 1 here. We've had the storm that we talked about. We've had this like cosmic level of the story introduced, and then we get what is called an ekphrasis. And an ekphrasis is a long breakout description. It was something that was very popular in long poetry, and as long as people were writing these lengthy poems, ekphrasis is a typical thing. It's often defined, ekphrasis is often defined as a description of a work of art, but it's actually bigger than that. It's any long description, and in this case, it's a description of a place, which we often also get in Homer, and it just means to kind of break out of the narrative. That's what ekphrasis means. Ekphrasdein in Greek means to sort of go outside of the story you're telling and embark upon a long description of something else. It's closely related to another concept in ancient literary criticism, and that is enargeia. Enargeia means vividness, bringing something before your eyes. And if you read the Progymnasmata, which is this collection of like school exercises that define some of these basic ancient terms, that's an ancient text, the Progymnasmata, and it talks about ekphrasis as a way of placing something vividly before your eyes. And these were sections that could easily be lifted out. So if you didn't want to read the whole Aeneid, but you still wanted to get some Virgil is designing this in part to be lifted out and excerpted and quoted, and something that can stand on its own. And so when Aeneas washes up on shore in Carthage, we know, or we're about to realize, that he is on the verge of this great power conflict, that he's entering into this struggle, this epic cosmic struggle between Rome in its infancy, in its pre-infancy, an embryonic state, and Carthage in its established city form. And we're being told that that's going on, and at the outset of that, we get this description of the shore, and that's the ekphrasis. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to talk about what Virgil is doing here and how he is setting this scene in a way that makes it intensely vivid and lets us enter into it as Aeneas and picture it the way Aeneas might have seen it, but also clues us in that this is more than just any shore. This is like Danger Will Robinson. This is something that is really going to bring Aeneas to the testing point in the way that Rome was brought to the testing point with Carthage. So here it is. And it starts with the classic introduction of a place ekphrasis, a description of place, which is est locus. There is a place. And Virgil is winking at us there in ways that we will see in a second. So there is a place, this is my translation, there is a place set deep within a cove. The island makes a portal with its jutting sides, against which every breaker crashes from the ocean deep and doubles back upon the shore. On either side, the double rows of cliffs and crags loom upward, menacing the sky, and stretching out secure beneath their peaks, a silent woodland scene with groves and fluttering leaves, bristling with shadows, underneath a cave, arrayed with thrones of living rock, the waters sweet within, nymph-haunted. Okay. So there's a lot going on here. There are at least three levels. There's the cliffs, these double cliffs, which form a kind of inlet into the island. So we can imagine the still waters within that, because the arms of the island, like the two spits basically of land, are making the waves crash up against the outside, and they don't make it into this water. And inside we have these groves on the side of the mountains, these cliffs that menace, they minantor, they're threatening the sky. So there's something incredibly ominous about this place, but it's also a haven. It's also where there are sweet waters, there are nymphs. Are the nymphs good or bad? Divine powers are potentially helpful, but also terrifying, as we have just seen from the storm. And so Virgil is giving us a sense of real terror with the cliffs and perhaps the woods that are bristling with shadows, but then this cave and the sweet waters may be somewhere that we can finally chill and relax. So if you just read the passage without any of the knowledge of any of the other stuff that we've been talking about, I think you might get a lot of that. You would say this is a place with some threatening cliffs, this is a place with some bristling woods, but also a place with nymphs and sweet waters, and you can see it kind of in your mind's eye, even though it would be hard, I think, to draw. There's definitely a level on which this is kind of vivid. This is ekphrasis in its classic form. And yet underneath the surface of this passage, there's a whole bunch of references and callbacks and allusions and what we call parallels. And this is an important subject for us because I get this question a lot when people are writing in and they're just starting to read ancient literature. Maybe you've never encountered Homer or Virgil before, and people ask me all the time, how do I get started? Because I feel like when I read epic especially, or when I read anything, I have to know all of the allusions, everything that the author is referring to and calling back to, and I just feel like I'm not going to get the poem unless I can see in every line how he's referring to 5 different things. And it makes you feel like you have to have encyclopedic knowledge to get started on any of this stuff. And I totally get that, and I understand. But the best way to think about this, I suspect, is to compare it to hip-hop. So if you listen to hip-hop music, and if you listen to any of that genre, anything in that kind of cluster of genres, hip-hop, rap, R&B, you know that there are all sorts of allusions and tracks and things that get kind of sampled and picked up, and many different hip-hop songs are like stitched together out of references to other stuff. And if you like listen to like Kendrick Lamar, you will find all these other references to like older stuff that has gone before. And if you know music history, that can be really cool and fun, and it can be kind of entertaining to be like, oh, I know, wow, that's a needle drop from like 1970, and here's why he's putting that in there and all of that stuff. But unless the song works without any of that, it's not a good song. So if you play a hip-hop song, if you like hip-hop, I'm not actually a big hip-hop guy, but if you like hip-hop, you play a hip-hop song without knowing anything else, you can get the beat, you can feel the music, right? You can be in it, and you don't need to know all that stuff, but you might start to get curious about it because it has that immediate arresting artistic appeal. You might want to know more about the history, and that might increase your enjoyment and your pleasure if you get more erudite, more learned about hip-hop. Then that can kind of open new doors and can reveal new meaning. But the song sucks. The song fails unless it has immediate power, unless you can instantly kind of enjoy it and enjoy the language of it and enjoy the sound and the music without knowing any of that background stuff. And that's how epic poetry also is supposed to work. It is true that there's a ton of history, that there's all this complexity that we've been talking about today and we're going to keep talking about that's going to help us to understand this poem better. But unless the thing grabs you off the bat, the poet has failed. And I think the great works of literature, even more than hip-hop, way more than hip-hop, grab you immediately. And you should be able to just enjoy this stuff without worrying that you're going to, quote-unquote, miss the illusions. You should just enjoy it, first of all, as a great story. And I think that passage that I just read is a beautiful passage. And there are all sorts of moments. The Mandelbaum translation gets this really well, where you're like, wow, this is just a cool adventure story. This guy is kind of like an Odysseus figure. He's in this God-haunted world, but he's trying to save his comrades and all that stuff. And now here's this cove, and we get this beautiful description. There is a place set deep within a cove. The island makes a portal with its jutting sides, against which every breaker crashes from the ocean deep. It's beautiful, right? So you should rest assured that you should be able to enjoy the poem without knowing all of this background stuff. And then once you enjoy the poem, you can get drawn into learning more and more about it and uncovering all of these endless depths. There's something here for us in every line. For instance, when we get this word skyna in Latin, which means scene, I've translated it as a woodland scene. Virgil means for us to think of this as a kind of stage set, as a kind of artistic work of art, as well as a setting. And there's all sorts of allusions in every word. This is the use of a really good commentary. So there are scholarly commentaries you can get, for instance, the Cambridge Green and Yellow books, where they will tell you in detail, line by line, all of the little places where there are different references and allusions being made. And I'm going to tell you some of that now. But that stuff comes after you have first enjoyed the poem as a story. And just like a hip-hop song, you should kind of enjoy the thing, you should be attracted to the thing on its own, and then you can follow up and chase and discover all of these allusions that make it richer and give it more detail. But don't worry that you have to understand every allusion. Nobody understands every allusion except maybe like a few people who have spent their whole lives as Virgil scholars. I definitely don't understand every allusion that is going on, but I've been reading this stuff for a while, and I've spent a lot of time on it, so I can see some stuff. Like I can see that this is an ekphrasis. I can see that there is an argaea here, and I know that this is a famous passage because I was given it to translate in high school. And so I know that there's like a lot here, and then I can go to my commentary and I can say, well, what are some of the other passages that are being kind of invoked and referred to here? Well, one of them is actually a series one reference that's going on here is a series of passages from the Odyssey. And this really is where we start to see that we're playing with Homer's Odyssey here. And because this is an ekphrasis of a place, and specifically of a cove, a bay that we are coming to after a long journey at sea, and because it is introduced with this est locus, there is a place, we know that we're kind of getting a callback to a bunch of different places. So you go and look, where are the places where Homer does ekphrasis and describes a cove and a bay? Well, there are a few. There's one, for instance, when Odysseus comes up on the place of the Laestrygonians, whom you may remember as the cannibals, the cannibal monsters of the Odyssey. There's another similar passage, a similar description of a cove and ekphrasis when he's about to come to the place of the Cyclops, the land of the Cyclops, where, if you will recall, the giant monster threatens to eat all of his men and then eat Odysseus. There's also Calypso's cave, where he ends up getting trapped for many, many years by the witch nymph Calypso. So when you start to see these things, you start to lay out, okay, so here are all these places where Homer does something similar to this. And this is what may be the mood that Virgil wants to conjure up here. Well, okay, so we've got the cannibals, we've got the one-eyed monster, and we've got the nymph witch. And there's actually one other place in another poem by Virgil, which is the Georgics, his poem about kind of farming and pastoral life, where he repeats almost the exact same line about the waves breaking and doubling back on themselves. And this is an introduction of the cave of Proteus, who is another person we know actually from the Iliad, also from Homer, but a sort of a trickster god, an old man who turns into all these different things. So if we didn't know all of these things, we would still be able to appreciate this beautiful passage, but we might not understand that what we're being told here is, here be dragons. This is a passage that's supposed to be full of divine and mythological menace. It's telling us, okay, the Cyclops, the Lystragonians, Calypso, Danger Will Robinson, these are not like easy people to deal with. And so we might imagine, if we've read our Homer and if we kind of know what Virgil is doing here, we start to feel like it's that Ralph Wiggum meme. If you've seen Ralph Wiggum from The Simpsons, where he goes, I'm in danger. We've just seen who Aeneas is, right? He is not the guy that's going to just totally stride up to the Cyclops or to the Lystragonians and conquer them. He is the guy that is going to be very, very upset and vulnerable and worried about the danger that might come to him. And so what we're going to do next time, now that we understand what's going on, we understand that this is Carthage, this is the place of war, this is the grand conflict of all history, and Aeneas is going in there like a lamb to the slaughter, and we hear now the kind of rustlings, the whispers of the mythic nymphs and monsters that he is up against, that he's about to go and fight. And all of those monsters are kind of in the background as we meet what seems like a perfectly nice set of Carthaginian people. So what we're going to do next time is we're going to meet the Carthaginians, and most importantly, we're going to meet their queen, Dido, who is one of the major characters for Aeneid and big part of his journey next time. But we understand what's going on so much more because we've seen what Virgil is doing. He's not just calling back to Homer, although he is calling back to Homer. He's using Homer and the menace of the Homeric mythological world to tell us that Aeneas is not out of the woods yet. In fact, he might be diving into his greatest challenge to date. So that's what we will pick up with next time as we continue through Book 1 of the Aeneid. Before I go, though, I'm going to answer a mailbag question. So mailbag questions come to me on Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. This is the easiest way to get in touch with me. If you've got anything that you want me to talk about more, anything that you want me to explore further, any clarifications that you're looking for, I would welcome them, and Substack is the best place to get that. It's also where I post my weekly essays and thoughts, and so you can get all sorts of extra goodies, especially if you want to become a paid subscriber. That helps me a lot. It helps me not to take too many ads, and it helps me not to deal with, like, you know, it supports the show and helps me to continue making this at the level that I want to be making it. So please do consider becoming a paid subscriber. And I got a question directly about the Aeneid that I just wanted to answer and clarify, and that is, somebody said to me, wrote in a DM on Substack, and said, I don't understand. You keep talking about Aeneas, and you keep talking about Aeneas as the founder of Rome, but, like, wasn't there a whole Romulus and Remus thing? And she was remembering there was sort of another story about Romulus and Remus, the twins, right, who have to do battle in order to found the city. And Rome, the city of Rome, is actually named after Romulus. So what's going on here? And this is related to what I was talking about last time, which is, why has Virgil chosen Aeneas, who is kind of obscure and doesn't actually seem directly related to Rome? So this is good and basically a clarifying question that I wanted to get in here so that we understand what we're talking about. Aeneas is not the founder of Rome per se. He's the founder of what will become Rome, of the line that will give rise to Rome. And the most obvious Rome founder, that is Romulus, would have been the person that we might expect Virgil to turn to. Instead, he's going deeper into the history so that he can unearth some of this stuff about Carthage. His point, part of his purpose, is to connect us to that Homeric world, to connect us to the history and the fall of Troy, and also to get that encounter with Dido and Carthage in there so that he can make us understand what has just happened in that playing the tape in reverse kind of way, so that he can cast the Punic Wars as this grand cosmic struggle. He needs Aeneas to do that. But Aeneas, when he gets to the end of this whole thing, after he performs all of his labors and suffers and loses all this stuff and finally founds the city he found is going to be called Lavinium. And Lavinium, we will get to this down the road, but Lavinium is not Rome. Lavinium is kind of the ancestor city to Rome. And Aeneas' son, Ascanius, is going to found Alba Longa, and Alba Longa is the city from which ultimately we get Romulus and Remus. And Romulus and Remus have a whole other myth about how they were abandoned at birth and how they end up taking over and taking control. And then Romulus and Remus fight with one another. And obviously Romulus kills Remus, and that's how he gets to name the city after himself. So if you are wondering like what's going on here, what we're dealing with is the ancestral story that will ultimately lead us to Romulus and Remus. And it's interesting that Virgil doesn't choose to write an epic about that, because what he wants to do is actually give us a picture of Rome that is set within a much grander cosmic history than just this local story of Romulus and Remus. So he's taking in Romulus and Remus, but he's pulling the camera even further back to the founder of Lavinium, which is the first place where the race of the Trojans establishes its foothold in Italy and then will ultimately lead to producing the people of Rome. All right, that's a great question. I welcome all other further clarifying questions or background questions or other stuff just about life, the universe, and everything at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Please, if you have not yet, pick up a copy of my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World. It's a history of science from a religious perspective that goes all the way up to the present day with quantum physics and its relationship to Scripture and Genesis. I will drop a link to that in the notes. Rate, review, share, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, become a subscriber at Young Heretics Show. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.